how do I choose the project? I find things that interest me, that I find interesting and challenging, and that I think will keep me occupied and happy, and finding out something new. I like to do things differently each time, different kinds of subjects. Well, I'm usually working on the projects that I hope will come. So, and there have been studio films and then independent films, or things about docudramas and things about real subjects. And getting those ready and working on them takes time. So I did a film about journalists in Central America, and about AIDS, the band played on. They take time and you work on them, and again on Rwanda and various projects I've worked on. So that's in between the ones you more notice. They take a long time to get scripts written and write and find the money. Well, there's a couple that I'm not so pleased with, yes. I'll leave it at that. The films that have interested me the most while I'm making them. Actually, the recent one was very interesting, and I made a film about Hiroshima and a film about AIDS that I mentioned, and the film in Rwanda. I did 2 films in Rwanda, a documentary and a drama. They were absolutely fascinating to work on. Yes, it is very different. They expect to make them the same and yet different. So you have this form and structure and bond and the character and the whole history. At the same time, you try and do something the producers wants to find a different story, a different way of telling it. So it's an interesting exercise in that way. And you have all sorts of wonderful toys to play with. There's a lot of, the budgets are huge. You have to do something different. So they're challenging, they're fun. I think digital is very good. And much as I love celluloid, I do think digital is obviously it's here to stay, and I think it has wonderful advantages. So, and I think for most people, it's hard to tell the difference on the final, Not necessarily, but it's just different. Yeah, but they weren't shot on 70. It doesn't. I grew up, my father was busy and my uncle were designing 3D. This is in the very late 40s and early 50s. So I grew up where innovation was very important, technical innovation was very important. And I remember my father rather saddened in the middle 50s by the fact that he made it work, but he also felt that the only thing that really mattered with cinema was the story, what you were saying. And that the technology was interesting, but not so very interesting. The heart of cinema is storytelling. And that's the most important. And you can get lost shooting things 5 times the normal speed and in 3D or 4D or virtual and in the end, what really counts, I think, is the story. Whether you have something to say about humanity or the human heart, Well, I've stopped doing that recently. I just used David Hirschfelder, who did the Chinese film I worked on, The Children of Guangxi, and then he did the Rwanda film, and he did the score. There are songs in the new film, but he did the score of this. and he did the score for the documentary. And we are very he's a wonderful composer, and we're very sympathetic, and we find the scores together. He finds them. I adored it, but because I come from the cutting rooms, we sort of find part of the score in the cutting room before or with the composer at the same time. But in this case, before I met Jerry, I think my brother had suggested some music, and we used it in the film. And so when I came to meet Jerry, he didn't want to hear what I had on the film. And I didn't want to show him the film without the music. So we had a sort of tussle. And in the end, he listened. And in the end, he came to love the score. He wrote a beautiful score. But it came from ideas that were already on the film and were with us while we were shooting the film. So I adored him, and he wrote this gorgeous score. And it takes nothing away from him that we had some of the ideas for the pan flutes have become a cliche now, but then they were not. And anyway, that came about in an interesting way, and I adore. I think he's a great composer. Patton is one of the great scores, and Under Fire is lovely too. I think it was a BBC. It's not the same theme. It wasn't that. It's not the Jerry. It was the music of the Andes, and I think it was from a BBC series. They had done a documentary series, and I heard it. So I think my brother showed it. I think it came from there. I don't know, but I heard these flutes and things, and I'd been to Tuxtla Gutierrez, and we'd been obviously shooting around Oaxaca. I'd spent a lot of time in Mexico by then, and gone down the river that's in the film, and it all. So before we started shooting, that was kind of the voice of the music. He was very, very charming, and yeah, I think we worked separately a lot, but that was a question of we didn't have much of a temp track, and I think he did a lot of that himself. I think we were. He took us away from the temp track rather, but it was very, it was a very nice score. As everyone has said, he was a very unusual character. Very strong, very interesting, and a real filmmaker. And he shot a lot of wonderful footage. He loved editors, so he gave one an enormous amount of footage, of interesting footage and many choices. And he gave one a lot of freedom, but in the end, it was always his film. But he would never tell you what to do. So he was a very interesting, passionate, funny, angry, joyful, crazy, extreme person. I liked him a lot. He was terrific. It was his first film, and it was a sort of learning process for all of us anyway, and it was a nice script. He did a very good job. He was, and out of that, I wrote something with him. I stayed at his flat, his house actually, while we were cutting. Some of the time I was at his home, and he was working on another script, and then he said, "Well, why don't you help?" So we worked on it together. It was a Western. It didn't get made in the end, but it got, De Laurentiis was going to buy it. And then I was asked to write 48 hours. And I was asked to write it for Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin. And we had to get both those actors. And we only got one of them. I forget. I think we got, I'm not sure whether we got Lee or Clint, but we didn't get them both, so the film wasn't made. And it was put into somebody's, closet or drawer. And then it came out 5 years later. And Eddie Murphy was this young television, Saturday Night Live. And it was terrific. And he played Lee Marvin's part. It was it was great. And Walter rewrote it, and somebody else rewrote it, and they changed it for Eddie, which was great. And yeah, so these things, it's a strange process. The new film is about a homeless person, a homeless street busker, street musician, a young man who'd been homeless for 15 years, and he'd become a heroin addict, and he was going downhill, and it's about his life and how it was turned around. And it became he's now cured and he's well, and it all changed. And I was, at the time, this was 2 years ago, I was trying to make a documentary about homeless people. And that was very difficult. It had been done before, and it was hard to find a way of telling that story that was interesting. And then I was shown this real true story of what happened to this young man, and I found it very compelling. So that's how it came about. Yes, I have one set in the 20s in England. About an interesting couple who were sort of ahead of their time by 30 or 40 years in terms of changing the way people didn't get married or lived together, and that sort of the modern world. They were doing it earlier than most people. And I'm working on a script about a painter, a woman in the 17th century. Yeah, and a Second World War story, again about young women.